Greetings. It is that time of the month again. Time for my monthly inflation scorecard, which longtime viewers are familiar with. I take a comprehensive and holistic measurement of inflation so as not to be dependent on any one index or even any one type of inflation measurement, so that we get around any accusations about an inflation index being rigged or the measurement not being comprehensive enough. And therefore, I take the 10-year window of each of these three, the 10-year compound annual growth rate of the US CPI, the 10-year compound annual growth rate of the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index, which is the most important of the three, as I explain each month, and then the 10-year US Treasury yield. And I require all three of these to be above 3% before I will say inflation is structurally high. If only one of these three is above 3%, then that does not mean that inflation is structurally high, because the other two are below 3%. And 3% is optimal. That doesn't mean that if it's slightly above 3%, then we are in trouble. That just means it's slightly higher than optimal. 3% is optimal because that is the perfect balance between not having high inflation to the extent that it harms poor people, but enabling technological progress to proceed at a good clip, because inflation is fuel for technological progress, as I explained in many other videos on this channel. And 3% is the optimal trade-off between the two. Inflation lower than 3% is a sluggish economy for anything that is innovation-oriented or high-growth technology companies, which is where all net new wealth creation comes from. Above 3%, yes, that's when basic necessities become too expensive for poor people. Some people may take a view that, hey, if inflation is fuel for technological progress, then inflation well above 3% would be good, and who cares about the poor people? They'll just die off. But I don't take that view. Their lives matter as well, and therefore I say 3% is the optimal rate of inflation. Lower than that becomes suboptimal, and deflation is certainly bad. If you think deflation is good, then you have a lot of learning to do about the nuances between inflation and deflation. It's a much more complicated subject than you may realize if you think deflation would be good. So let us go through these three measurements in succession. We can begin with the 10-year U.S. Treasury yield. 10-year U.S. Treasury yield, it is at 4.07%, so above 3%. It's been range-bound for about 2 years, getting as high as almost 5% in late 2023 and falling a couple of times since then, but it's back to 4.07%. So that is above 3%. These yields are a major determinant of real estate pricing, both on the rent side and the home price side. And while this is not necessarily a measurement of past inflation, it is an indicator of future inflation expectations and certainly governs current prices for anything housing related. Now we go to the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index. Goldman Sachs Commodity Index, 10-year window and 10-year compound annual growth rate, minus 0.15%. It is in deflation. It is nowhere close to 3%. And the reason that this is the most important index of the three, as I often explain, is because this comprises of freely traded commodities, which means the index cannot be rigged. That is the favorite excuse of people who are desperate to overstate inflation, saying that all the indices are rigged. This cannot be rigged because oil, gold, natural gas, etc. all trade freely at one world price, and it's worldwide in nature. So this whole thing about the US dollar versus other currencies, that also is eliminated. And this is in deflation, minus 0.15%. Oil is down 50% from its record high, which was 16 years ago. Natural gas has fallen about 80% from its record high. And a lot of other commodities have risen a little bit, but it's still a very, very low compounded growth rate. So this is in deflation. Another reason that this is the most accurate inflation index is because commodities have a very low labor component, and therefore it is very simple, very unambiguous to say that when commodity prices are rising, that is bad. When commodity prices are in deflation, that is good. The same is not true for service prices, because service prices are tied to wages. If you pay for a service that increased in price, yes, you paid more, but the wages of that service provider also rose. Therefore, it was bad for person A, but good for person B. And then when person B buys a different service, they pay more, but then person C, who provided the second service, is earning more. So service prices rising or falling is inseparable from wage increases, and therefore very ambiguous about whether that is good or bad in any given instance. That's why commodity prices are the most comprehensive measurement, especially for ordinary people who can't grasp more nuance beyond prices rising is bad and prices falling is good. And commodity prices are a good way to simplify it down for them. Now we go to the third measurement, the US CPI. So this is the BLS.gov website, which is in the description box below, along with all the other links. And here we can see the US CPI. This is the US CPI over 10 years. It did rise at a faster rate in response to COVID stimulus, but now has again reduced to a lower trajectory. Therefore, to get the 10-year compound annual growth rate window, one would have to take this number divided by the number exactly 10 years prior, and that is the 10-year inflation amount, and then take the 10th root of that to see what the annual rate of increase over this 10-year period was. And we'll look at that in a table that follows this. But the 1 month percentage change, you can see things are drifting down. There was only a flurry that was more than 2 years in the past, yet people are still complaining about it. At the 2 month percentage change, we see the same effect. 3 month percentage change, the same effect. This one big inflation spike that was very temporary and ended some time ago still has people shocked that they were required to pay more for something, even though the rate of increase moderated back down really fast. 6 month percentage change, the same effect, and you see how it's falling now by a lot. And 12 month percentage change, the big spike more than 2 years ago, and again moderating back down. Now to convert these graphs into a tabular format, we go to this table that I display each month. This is a table that has been updated with the most recent month's reading, September 2024. As we saw, the 1 month, 2 month, and 3 month compound annual growth rates can be annualized to these CPI numbers through a process that I've explained. 1 month to the 12th power is a year, 2 months to the 6th power is a year, 3 months to the 4th power is a year, 6 months squared is a year. So these are the annual growth rates over those time windows. Over 1 year, as we saw, 2.4% compound annual growth rate. And over 2 years, there has been 5.7% CPI inflation in the US. That means per year, that's 2.8%. 3 years, 4.5%, 5 years, 4.2%, because of that one big spike in late 2021, early 2022, that is now receding into the past and is more than 2 years ago, so it only is visible in these 3-year and 5-year windows. It is part of this 10-year window. That is why we take a 10-year moving average so that distortions that are temporary get smoothed out. Over 10 years, we've had 32.9% US CPI inflation, which is 2.9% a year, getting close to that 3% optimal number, but not above it. And just for fun, I also add this line, which is since the beginning of the 21st century, since January 1st, 2001, 80% CPI inflation, which is 2.5% a year. Now we go back to my matrix. So we saw all three measurements, US CPI, GSCI, and 10-year US Treasury yield. And today on October 20th, 2024, the results are 2.9% for the US CPI, getting close to the 3% mark, although none of that is from recent months of inflation. The GSCI is in deflation. It is still far, far below 3%. It is extremely hard for this to ever get to 3% right now, and this is the most important measurement of the three as I have described. And the only one that is above 3% is this 10-year US Treasury yield. That is at 4.07%. So no, inflation is not high. I don't care what anyone says, because the people who claim that inflation is high tend to debate in a very unintelligent manner. They use anecdotes, always anecdotes of some unhealthy processed junk food. That is a very central part of their identity, I am finding. People who are worried about inflation should really be worried about inflammation, as I often say. But they always use these type of examples. A 6-pack of Coca-Cola or a Big Mac or Doritos, and that is how they measure inflation, not through some intelligent quantitative measurement. Now for the next part of this video, we will go to CNBC's sector-by-sector breakdown, because many people like to debate via anecdote, so we can look at what sectors actually are falling in price. This is CNBC's deflation breakdown for September 2024 in one chart. So while everyone should look at the indices, many people don't want to do that. So when you have someone toss over an anecdote, like the price of gasoline is 4 times higher than it was 40 years ago, or Doritos have increased in price, so it's harder to achieve an inflation result because of the greater expense of purchasing inflammation, you can counter with this data. Food at home, apples, minus 11.3%. An apple a day keeps the doctor away. Potatoes, lower in price, minus 3.5%. And other food items also in deflation. Energy, this is important, all energy, For all the complaining about energy bills and such going up, energy is in minus 6.8% deflation. And as I have proven at length in this video up here in the upper right-hand corner, energy prices have been falling to the extent that energy costs per household are shrinking as a percentage of household income. Gasoline, one of the biggest examples anyone puts forth when they're not talking about junk food and fast food, is gasoline. That's minus 15.7%. That's the greatest amount of deflation of any item on this bar chart. And then items other than food and energy, you can see that these are all in some degree of deflation as well. So yes, in the composite CPI, that was 2.4% per year of an increase. Some items were above that amount, but many were not only below 2.4% of a gain, but many are in actual deflation. So show this to anyone who debates inflation via tossing over very questionable anecdotes that they heard on a second or third hand basis. And we've made fun of how people do that in the past. So anyway, this was the monthly inflation update under my method. And no, inflation is not high. Money printing no longer causes nearly as much net inflation as it used to in the past because it is being offset by technological deflation. And I've proven that for many years. There's always some people desperate to feel like victims who want to insist that inflation is higher than it is, but the data just doesn't support that. So those people cannot be taken seriously. Now, if you like this type of content, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel, and thank you very much for watching.